Clay enjoyed all of the seasons. However, fall had a highest priority on his list. He loved the colors of the leaves as they fell to the ground, that same bright red as his hair. He loved that he could finally have an excuse to wear all of those layers of clothing, if only for a few months. Shoving his hands deeper into the pockets of his knee-length coat, he thought about his life this past year. It had definitely been a whirlwind. There was no doubt about that. Between Spamalot and the new album that came out this past May, he was shocked he even had time to breathe. Busy is better than dead, Clayton. His mother's voice obscured his thoughts. He chuckled to himself, thinking of his wonderfully quirky and loving mother. He was ashamed to admit it, but he hadn't been calling her as much as he should have. He made a vow to do so the following morning. The cool weather chilled him to the bone as he wandered up and down the nearly vacant streets. With his collar popped and a thick scarf around his neck, he was glad that nobody recognized him. He let himself blend in gloriously with the humdrum of everyday life, pretending that for once he was back in Raleigh as a teacher. He dreamt of all the different students in his class and how he'd help them. He also dreamt that he was leading a normal life and was just visiting the hustle and bustle of the city as a vacation. Clay smiled contentedly to himself at that thought, that he could have the time of his life for a week or two and then just get in on a plane amongst the normal audiences and leave it all behind. It wasn't that he wasn't satisfied with the way his life had turned out. He was. He was blessed immeasurably these past years since Idle, and he didn't waste a single breath in denying that it was anything but the Lord in his life. However, there were some parts of his life that he ached for do-over. He grinned as the hand over mouth and foot on the airplane seat flashed in his mind. He finally made it back to his apartment and lifted the keys from his coat pocket and stuck them into the lock, twisting it. He could hear the pleasant yip from Raleigh on the opposite side of the door. "Hey, girl," he crooned, scratching her behind the ears as he closed the door behind him. He pulled the heavy coat off of his broad shoulders and hung it on the tall, polished hanger by the door. The little dog yipped happily again while dancing through Clay's walking feet. He pushed the door to his bedroom open again and sat down on the bed. It made a creaking noise as he undid the cuffs of his shirt and loosened his tie. Not wanting to put forth much more effort, he undid his belt buckle and flopped back down on the bed, sighing. His face felt extremely warm from going from the chilled air to the heat of his apartment. Clay lifted his heels against the bed frame, letting his shoes clunk noisily to the floor. He smiled to himself as he wiggled his toes in comfort. He breathed in deeply, listening to the sound of his heart beating against his chest. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was so familiar and comforting that before he had time to protest, he was asleep. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of the sad events that have cursed our production, we have a new cast member. Please welcome Jacob Fox. He's going to be our dentist while Mr. Dean's ankle heals. I know you'll make him feel right at home. Mike smiled widely, adjusting his glasses on his nose. Jacob smiled at everyone, and Clay felt his knees nearly give out. He was tall and lanky, with a body that ensued that he could have easily been a model. No, not even a plain old model. He could have easily blown those Speedo and Abercrombie boys out of the water. Not that he was looking, of course. Jacob's mop of light brown curls fell into his intensely blue eyes as he listened to Mike give direction. No, he wasn't looking at all. Clay plopped on the floor of the dance studio with his legs stretched in front of him, forming a graceful V. His hands touched his left foot and leaned forward and stretched. His deep green eyes couldn't stay off of Jacob in front of him. He wore simple black warm-up pants with a dual gray stripe on either side of them. His gray tank top hugged his body perfectly. Clay gulped as he glanced at Jacob's smooth back, the gentle indent of his spine against his shirt. He swallowed and had to look away. Jacob clambered to his feet, turning to face the floor-to-ceiling mirrors on the opposite wall. He held his hands over his head to stretch, revealing the thin line of his delightfully toned stomach. Clay grunted in slight annoyance, adjusting his NCSU t-shirt over his stomach, and suddenly felt more than inadequate. "Okay, people, let's get going here." Casey Nicola entered the double doors and clapped his hands. Clay walked over to where the cast were lined up and began their rehearsing. Clay stepped to the front and began his number, watching Jacob through the mirror. A dark oval of sweat broke on Jacob's chest, driving Clay nearly up the wall, and he wasn't quite sure why. He had a date with Emily, who he really liked that night. What was wrong with him? He tore his eyes away and managed to finish the dancing without any more thought of Jacob. "That was good, people. Take 5. He clapped again and patted his towel against his forehead and sauntered out of the room. Clay sat against the mirror with one knee against his chest, resting his forearm on the kneecap. Jacob wiped his face and walked over. "Hey, I don't think we formally met. I'm Jake." He squatted by Clay and extended his hand, flashing a wonderful smile. Clay wiped his hands on the knee of his pants and smiled as well. "Nice to meet you, Jake. Clay." "Also known as Sir Robin, correct?" Jacob chuckled. Clay smiled and blushed. "Yeah." "I saw you up there. You were really good. I could feel Robin's spirit in the room," he said seriously, raising a hand in the air and putting his thumb and middle finger together, bringing it down to the middle of his chest. Clay chuckled softly as Jacob's blonde curls flitted around seamlessly. Jake gave Clay one more smile before turning and talking to another girl Clay didn't recognize. He watched with a sigh. Of course Jacob wouldn't be interested in males. That was just how his life worked. The practice droned on from that point. Clay's interest in the rehearsal completely shot. He didn't know why he was so upset. He wasn't gay. Why did he care about this guy's preferences? Casey came over to Jacob and rolled his eyes in annoyance. "I know that being 21 and all chit-chat is so important, but we have a show to rehearse." He nearly squawked, and Clay was slightly reminded of the seagulls down at the boardwalk. And then he groaned. 21. Clay was near pre-adolescence when this guy was born. Well, no wonder he was so perfectly put together. He had age on his side. Clay's bad mood seemed to carry on through the remainder of the day. When they were finally released, Clay grabbed his bag and hurried out of the dance hall before he had a chance to think about Jacob any more. He burst into the frigid air towards the sleek limousine waiting. He hopped in and the car pulled away from the curb. He let himself melt away from his thoughts and just stared at the mesh of faces that New York City had to offer. Clay's interest peaked as he saw Jacob walking down the sidewalk, now in jeans and a form-fitting sweater, his thumbs poking through the sleeves. He had a messenger bag slung over his broad chest and a black scarf around his neck. The mop of brown curls tangled under the black ski cap he donned. "Hey, Tony, stop for a second, will ya?" Clay asked, and the limo slowed. Clay rolled down the window as the cold air hit him like a punch in the face. "Jacob, it's cold. Need a ride?" he called. "What are you doing?" He wanted to get away from him. Jake turned and grinned gorgeously at him, approaching his window. The cars behind them, irritated for having to wait, honked viciously. "That'd be great, thanks. I took a taxi on the way down here, but couldn't get one on the way up to this area." Clay opened the door for him, and Jake slid in beside him. "Where to?" Clay asked. 12th and Central, please." Jake smiled as Clay repeated the address to Tony. The limo plugged off again. "Nice ride," Jake smiled at Clay. "Thank you." "So do you always have a limo pick you up, or do you just do this for special occasions?" Jake asked seriously. Clay blinked at him in confusion. "Excuse me?" he asked stupidly. Jake repeated the question, and Clay tried his best not to look like he was mentally incapable of conversation. "This is going to sound really egotistical, but I don't think there's any way around it. Do you know who I am?" It was then Jacob's turn to blink like an idiot. "You're Clay, and I'm Jake. We've established this." He closed his eyes and shook his head irritably. No, I mean, I'm a celebrity, I guess you'd say. I was on American Idol, multi-platinum recording artist." He felt himself go red as he called himself these things. He certainly didn't feel like this. Jacob's eyes widened in realization as Clay spoke. "Oh, right, you're the invisible guy." Clay grimaced and slightly nodded. Right, this guy was definitely not a homosexual.